A quiet evening in a small coastal town where an old naval engineer sits by his window, watching the waves roll in. He has grown older, slower, and a little more tired than he would like to admit. But his eyes still hold the same alertness they once did when he used to work in the Navy's engineering division. Every evening, he finds himself thinking about the same thing, a warship that almost no one remembers anymore. Some people think he clings to the past because he has nothing else left. Maybe that's partly true, but deep down, he knows there was something special about that ship. Something the world never fully understood. He used to walk into the shipyard every morning before sunrise, long before the rest of the crew arrived. The air would be cold, the smell of metal and welding sparks drifting around the unfinished hull of the vessel. It wasn't beautiful by normal standards. In fact, most people called it bulky, outdated, even ugly. But to him, it was like watching a child grow. Piece by piece, day after day, something new appeared. A panel, a support beam, a cable bundle. Every detail mattered to him. His team was small too, small for a project of that scale, but they worked with a strange kind of loyalty. They believed in the idea, even if the Navy didn't. The ship was an experiment, built in a time when new designs were rare and budgets were tight. Higher officials saw it as a backup plan, something to test ideas on, not something meant to shine in real missions. People in the higher offices had more exciting projects to talk about: sleek new destroyers, fast intercept ships, and shiny tech that made everyone feel like the future was already here. Compared to those, the engineer's ship looked like something from the past. He remembers the first time someone called it a floating museum piece. It was a joke, said in passing, but it spread through the shipyard like gossip always does. Workers laughed about it, officers smiled politely, but never took it seriously, and even technicians who worked in other departments rolled their eyes whenever they walked by. Only the engineer and his small team kept pushing forward, tightening bolts, testing circuits, and quietly hoping that one day someone would see what they saw, even after construction finished. The ship didn't receive the kind of welcome most new vessels did. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd, no applause. It simply slipped into the water one morning while the shipyard was half empty. Some people didn't even notice. The engineer felt a strange mix of pride and disappointment that day. He stood on the dock, hands in his pockets, watching the warship drift away for its first official test sail. He had imagined that moment many times, but in his dreams, it was always filled with celebration and excitement. In reality, it was quiet, almost lonely. Once the ship was assigned a crew, things didn't improve much. The crew was mostly made up of new recruits and officers who didn't have important placements yet. When they stepped aboard, many of them looked around with confusion, wondering why they had been assigned to such a vessel. The interior wasn't luxurious or modern. It was functional, simple, and sturdy. The crew learned quickly that the ship didn't have the glamour of modern vessels. The control panels looked old-fashioned. The hallways were narrow. The engine room felt more like an oversized workshop than a part of a naval ship. But beneath all that simplicity, the engineer knew something very few people understood. Every system inside that ship was built for reliability. Every sensor had a backup. Every motor had a support system. The ship was built to survive circumstances that most new ships weren't even tested for. But no one cared about those things. They only cared about how it looked, how fast it could go, or how modern its parts appeared. The engineer visited the ship after its first month at sea. He walked through the narrow corridors, smiling quietly to himself, even though the crew barely noticed him. The ship felt alive, and he could sense every small vibration and hum like a musician hearing notes in an instrument. But when he met with the crew, he could see the lack of enthusiasm in their eyes. They didn't dislike the ship. They just didn't feel proud of it. To them, it was just an assignment, a place to work until they got transferred to something better. Over the next few years, the ship remained in service, but saw very little action. It mostly stayed near the docks, performing routine patrols in safe waters where nothing exciting ever happened. New ships came and went, gaining attention and praise, while the engineer's ship stayed quietly in the background. Like a forgotten tool on a shelf, the engineer eventually retired, leaving behind the ship he had spent years building. Retirement wasn't easy for him. He had spent most of his life around machines, tools, and blueprints. Now, his days were filled with silence. He often visited the old shipyard, taking slow walks past the new vessels lined up for construction. Workers who remembered him would wave politely, but they never asked about the ship he once built. They never understood why he looked at the ocean with such longing. He kept a small wooden model of the ship in his home. He had carved it by hand during the early construction years, shaping it slowly each night. The paint had faded now, but he still kept it on his shelf. Sometimes he picked it up and ran his fingers over the edges, remembering the sound of welding, the smell of salt water, and the laughter of his small team as they worked late into the night. But deep inside, he always carried one quiet frustration. The world never gave his ship a chance. It was judged by appearances, mocked for looking outdated, and dismissed before anyone truly understood it. He often wondered what would have happened if someone in the Navy had taken the time to look at its systems properly, to test its capabilities seriously. Would things have been different? Would the ship have earned respect? He didn't know. But he kept one hope alive, a hope that someday, in some unexpected moment, the ship might finally be seen for what it really was. He didn't know how or when that moment would come. Maybe it never would. But something inside him refused to let go of the feeling that the ship was meant for more than gathering dust at the dock. Years after retirement, he found himself once again staring out at the sea, wondering where the ship was right now. He didn't have access to its location anymore, but he liked to imagine it somewhere out there, still floating, still working, still waiting for its chance to prove its worth. The engineer smiled softly at the thought. Even if no one else believed in that ship, he always would. He had seen its heart before anyone else did, and he knew it had more to give. He didn't realize it then, but the moment he had waited for all those years was already on its way. A slow shift in the world's atmosphere, something people didn't notice all at once, but gradually, like a pressure quietly building in the background. Over the years, the region near the contested waters had always seen small disagreements, but nothing serious ever happened. Fishing boats sometimes crossed invisible lines. Patrol ships exchanged warnings, but that was normal. People were used to it. But recently, things had changed. Foreign ships had begun appearing more often, larger ones too. Their presence was calm at first, almost polite, but it grew bolder with each passing week. They moved deeper into disputed waters, lingering longer than usual, watching every passing vessel with a cold, careful distance. News channels started showing satellite images of ships gathering far from the coast. At first, experts said it was nothing to worry about. Routine exercises, they claimed. Nothing unusual. But people who paid attention could feel something wasn't right. The conversations of fishermen, travelers, and workers around the ports slowly shifted. They whispered about how the sea didn't feel the same anymore, not far away from all of this. The retired naval engineer sat in his quiet home, still living his simple routine. He woke up early, made tea, and would sometimes walk toward the cliff at the edge of town just to watch the horizon. It always comforted him until the day he saw the news. Flashing on a nearby cafe's TV screen, the report showed a foreign fleet performing what they called extended patrols near the contested boundary. He knew that kind of language. Extended patrols meant preparation. Preparation meant tension. Tension meant something much larger could follow. His heart sank. He whispered to himself, "Not now. Not after all these years." The Navy tried to reassure the public by saying they were monitoring the situation. But behind closed doors, officers were panicking. They didn't have enough ships available nearby. Their newest vessels were either stationed in distant regions or undergoing major maintenance. And the foreign fleet was moving faster than expected. So the Navy made a decision, a practical one, though not a proud one. They deployed the forgotten warship, the same one the engineer had spent years building, the same one everyone laughed at. It wasn't chosen because it was the strongest or the most advanced. It was chosen simply because it was there. It was available. It could sail immediately. Most officers didn't expect it to do much. They believed the foreign fleet would ignore it or simply treat it as a harmless sight. The warship wasn't supposed to stand up to anyone. It was just meant to show presence, like a placeholder representing the country while they waited for reinforcement ships. When news of the deployment reached the engineer, he froze. He stared at the TV screen as if he had misheard something. Then he leaned closer. The image clearly showed the ship's familiar design, sailing through calm water toward the disputed area. His old ship, his creation, the one everyone ignored. A strange mix of emotions flooded him. Pride, fear, hope, restlessness. His hands trembled slightly as he held his cup of tea. He whispered, "Why that ship? After all these years?" But the answer was obvious, because the Navy had no other option nearby. Meanwhile, on the warship itself, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The crew had grown used to their quiet assignments, so being told to head toward a high-tension zone felt unreal. The commanding officer, a calm and disciplined man, tried to speak to everyone with confidence. He told them this was just a precautionary mission. They would monitor the situation, send reports, and that would be the end of it. He didn't want the crew to panic. He didn't want them to think they were being sent into danger. But deep down, even he wasn't sure what would happen. As the ship moved closer to the contested waters, the crew could see the foreign vessels on the radar large, modern, fast. Their signals were strong, their patterns precise. The junior officers exchanged nervous looks, but they continued working quietly. No one wanted to show fear. The commanding officer ordered the communications team to maintain a polite, professional tone. They were not there to start conflict. They were there to maintain calm. The engineer, watching from his home, felt helpless. He had no authority, no role, no involvement anymore. He was just an old man in a small house near the sea. But he knew the ship better than anyone else alive. He knew every joint, every panel, every circuit. He had spent years imagining the challenges it might face out at sea, yet he never imagined it would face something like this. He spent the rest of the day checking updates on the news, switching channels, refreshing online sites, searching for even the smallest detail. But the Navy kept most information private. All he knew was that his ship was out there, facing vessels that looked stronger, newer, and more intimidating. As the warship approached the disputed line, the sky began to change, painting long golden streaks across the waves. The crew stood at their stations, watching the horizon. The foreign fleet was clearly visible now, sleek hulls, tall towers, shining surfaces reflecting the sunset. Compared to them, the old warship looked almost humble, like a veteran soldier among young, overconfident recruits. But humility is not weakness. The engineer would have said. At sea, the commanding officer contacted the foreign fleet, sending a routine message reminding them of the maritime boundary. He kept his voice calm, steady, formal. The reply came quickly, but coldly. The foreign ships insisted they were still in international waters. Their tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It felt like a warning disguised inside politeness. The crew exchanged more uneasy glances. They had studied these kinds of interactions in training. Everyone knew polite tension was sometimes more dangerous than open hostility. The commanding officer ordered everyone to remain alert, but avoid any provocative action. The engine room hummed steadily, a sound the engineer always loved. The crew there performed their checks with silent focus. They knew the ship wasn't the most celebrated vessel in the Navy, but at that moment, it was the only one standing between the two sides. That responsibility settled heavily on their shoulders. As night approached, the foreign fleet changed formation. This was unusual. Instead of maintaining a straight line, they shifted into a pattern that allowed them to surround a specific zone. The warship was just outside that zone, but close enough to feel the pressure. The crew reported the change immediately. The commanding officer remained composed, though inside he felt a knot tightening. He sent another message, asking for clarification. This time, the foreign ships didn't respond right away. The silence felt louder than any communication could have been. Back on land, the engineer stared at the darkening sea from his window, feeling a heaviness he couldn't shake. He didn't know the exact details of what was happening, but he sensed the tension rising. He imagined the crew on board, young and anxious, trying their best to stay calm. He imagined the officers studying the radar, checking readings, double-checking coordinates. He remembered the early days of designing the ship. He remembered the compromises, the long nights, the small victories, the failures, the adjustments. He had built that vessel to be strong, to be reliable, to handle situations where modern ships might fail. But no one had ever truly tested it. Now, it seemed the world was about to test it in the most unexpected way. The foreign fleet finally responded, but their message was different this time. Their tone was sharper. They claimed they were following new instructions and would continue their path. It wasn't a direct threat, but it carried an edge that no one could ignore. The warship continued its slow, steady path, trying to maintain distance while still holding its position. The crew felt every second stretch longer than the last. The commanding officer walked across the deck, looking out at the water, thinking deeply about what might come next. He knew one thing clearly. If things escalated, they would be alone until reinforcements arrived, and reinforcements were still far away. The engineer finally stepped away from his window, but only to sit down and rest his weary legs. His mind raced with thoughts. The ship he built, the one dismissed by so many, was now standing alone in front of an entire fleet. He whispered a quiet prayer, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. Maybe he was simply talking to the sea. The tension in the region kept rising through the night. No one was sure what the next day would bring. But the engineer had a feeling, a deep instinct, that something significant was about to happen, something that would change the ship's fate forever. The morning, just a few hours after the long, tense night. The sun was rising slowly, turning the sky soft orange and pink. The sea looked calm, almost peaceful, as if it had no idea what had happened the night before or what was about to happen now. The crew on the forgotten warship had barely slept. Some carried dark circles under their eyes. Others tried to stay fresh by drinking cup after cup of hot tea. But one thing was clear: even though everyone felt tired, no one dared to relax. The radar operators were the first to notice something unusual. The foreign fleet had shifted again, moving closer to the boundary line where they were never supposed to be. It wasn't a full advance, but it wasn't harmless either. It was the kind of slow, intentional movement that made people question motives. The commanding officer gathered the bridge crew and studied the screens carefully. He didn't want to panic anyone, but he also didn't want to ignore what was happening. "Keep your focus," he told his team quietly, "and report every small movement." Down in the engine room, The crew checked the systems again. They knew the ship wasn't perfect, and they knew many outsiders doubted its strength. But they also knew something the world didn't. The ship had been built with extreme care and precision by a man who had poured his whole heart into it. Even though the engineer was no longer part of the Navy, his fingerprints existed in every bolt, every cable, every piece of design. The crew didn't know him personally, but they could feel his work whenever the engines hummed steadily beneath their feet. By mid-morning, the foreign fleet sent a message. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't openly hostile either. It said they were conducting territorial checks and expected full cooperation. The crew exchanged looks. Everyone understood the meaning behind those words. They weren't checking anything. They were testing the warship, testing how far they could push without facing consequences. The commanding officer responded calmly, reminding them of international rules and the established boundary. His voice stayed steady, even though inside he felt a knot of concern. The foreign ships didn't reply. Silence settled over the ocean again. On land, the retired engineer sat in front of his small TV, watching news updates nonstop. Every report felt the same, vague, uncertain, and incomplete. He wanted details, real details. He wanted to know how his ship was performing, how the crew was feeling, how close the foreign fleet was. But he had no access to military channels anymore. All he could do was hope. Sometimes he got up and paced around the room, unable to sit still. Other times he just stared at the horizon, as if expecting to see the ship appear from behind the waves. By noon, the situation changed again. One of the foreign vessels broke formation and moved closer to the boundary than any of them had before. It wasn't a small ship. It was one of their larger vessels, known for its advanced navigation systems. The crew on the forgotten warship watched as it approached on radar, then through binoculars. The distance wasn't small anymore. It was now close enough to be considered a direct challenge. The commanding officer immediately tried to contact the ship, sending a clear, formal message reminding them of international limits. But again, there was no response. Instead, the foreign vessel adjusted its speed slightly, edging even closer. The tension on the deck felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. Some of the younger crew members whispered to each other in worried voices. They weren't prepared for this. The forgotten warship had never been part of any major confrontation. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, the kind where nothing ever happened. No one imagined they would one day stand face to face with a fleet many times stronger. Inside the ship, in the control room, one of the technicians kept checking the ship's automated defense systems, a system most people believed barely worked. It had been tested only in controlled conditions, and even then, people doubted its performance. But it was there, built with unusual engineering features that most officers never bothered to understand. The retired engineer, sitting miles away in his small home, suddenly had a strange feeling, one he couldn't explain. It was almost like his instincts were whispering something. He leaned forward in his chair, gripping the armrests tightly. His ship was designed for situations where calm negotiation wasn't enough, where confusion and pressure collided. He just didn't expect such a moment to arrive long after he had retired. Out at sea, the foreign vessel made a move that changed everything. It wasn't an aggressive strike or anything violent, but it was dangerous enough to trigger alarms on the warship. The foreign ship came close enough that their navigation signals interfered with the warship's sensors. For a moment, the screens on the bridge flickered. A few crew members gasped. The commanding officer slammed a command into the console, restoring systems manually. And then it happened. A sudden automated alert flashed across the screens. The ship's emergency defense system activated itself. The crew scrambled in shock. They had trained for emergencies, but none of them had ever seen the system activate on its own. It wasn't designed to attack. It was designed to protect by reacting to clear threats. The system scanned the environment instantly. The foreign ship had crossed the threshold that triggered the ship's automatic shield protocols. The defense system adjusted energy distribution, strengthened the hull's stability, and prepared countermeasures, not weapons. But defensive tools meant to neutralize danger without harming anyone. The commanding officer tried to override the system, but the engineer's design had one special feature. In moments of immediate danger, the system could not be fully shut down unless the threat moved away. This idea had been mocked years ago as unnecessary and outdated. Now it activated flawlessly. The foreign vessel seemed startled too. They abruptly changed direction, unsure what the warship was doing. They must have picked up unusual signals from the ship. For a few tense seconds, both vessels floated in silence, watching each other, waiting for the next move. The crew felt their heartbeats pounding. They didn't know whether to stay calm or prepare for something bigger. Some held onto their consoles tightly. Others kept their eyes glued to the radar. The commanding officer took a deep breath and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Stay steady. Don't panic. Let the system do its job." The foreign ship finally sent a message short, tense and confused. They demanded to know why the warship had activated emergency protocols. The commanding officer replied with steady confidence, explaining that the foreign vessel had crossed too close and triggered automatic safety measures. The foreign ship didn't like that answer. They moved again, this time in a way that looked more like a challenge than an accident. Not violent, but bold. And the forgotten warship responded again. The defensive system increased power to its stabilizers. Lights flickered as the ship adjusted. Audible alerts echoed through the hallways. The crew braced themselves, gripping seats, holding consoles, focusing intensely. The foreign fleet immediately noticed the sudden rise in energy output. Their formation shifted slightly. They were no longer testing, they were re-evaluating. The old warship no one respected was suddenly displaying behavior no one expected. On land, the retired engineer watched breaking news appear on the screen. Reporters mentioned unexpected activity near the disputed waters. His heart almost stopped. He knew instantly what that meant. He whispered to himself, "It's waking up. The ship is waking up." He didn't know how things would unfold, but he sensed that everything was changing. The forgotten warship was no longer just standing watch. It was stepping into the moment it had been waiting for all along. The sun climbed higher over the horizon, spreading warm light across the calm sea. From above, everything seemed peaceful, but the bridge of the forgotten warship was filled with tension and focused energy. The crew had not slept properly in days, and fatigue weighed heavily on their shoulders, yet no one allowed themselves to relax. Every movement, every sound, every blip on the radar was being observed, analyzed, and double-checked. The crew knew this was not a normal mission anymore. The foreign fleet remained near the boundary, trying to figure out what had just happened. The old warship had surprised them with its sudden activation, demonstrating defensive systems no one had expected. The crew could see the hesitation in the radar readings, and it gave them a quiet sense of relief. They were alone out there, far from reinforcements. But at least now, the playing field felt slightly less dangerous. The commanding officer moved steadily across the bridge, watching the screens and giving clear, concise orders. He kept his voice calm, even though inside he felt the same tension as the rest of the crew. "Keep monitoring the formation. Do not overreact. Let the system handle its part," he said firmly. The crew nodded, following the orders without question. They had trained for moments like this, but no training could have fully prepared them for the reality of the situation. In the engine room, the humming of the machinery seemed louder than usual. Every sound was amplified in the silence of tension. Technicians checked and rechecked the power levels, making sure the automated systems were functioning exactly as designed. Every panel, every gauge, every screen displayed the ship's performance. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a normal day, but for the crew, each display was a life or death measure. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It had become their protector, their partner in this unknown challenge. On land, the retired engineer followed updates with growing anxiety and fascination. Reports were sparse and vague, but he could sense the magnitude of what was unfolding. For years, he had worried that the ship he designed and built would never be appreciated. He had dreamed that someday, somehow, people would recognize its true potential. Now, years after leaving the Navy, it seemed that recognition was finally happening, in a way he could never have predicted. He felt pride, fear, hope, and disbelief all at once. He whispered quietly, "Hold steady. Hold steady." Back at sea, the foreign fleet adjusted their positions, clearly confused and cautious. The commanding officer watched carefully. Every move they made was calculated, deliberate, but it lacked confidence. They had never expected this ship to perform so effectively. For years, they had heard it was an outdated vessel, not worth worrying about. Now, their assumptions were being challenged in real time. The ship's defensive systems were still operating. Not aggressively, but firmly, showing that the vessel could protect itself and its crew under pressure. It wasn't about attacking. It was about stability, control, and survival. This was exactly what the engineer had envisioned years ago, designing a system that could adapt, respond, and protect automatically. The sophistication of the technology, hidden beneath a simple exterior, had remained unnoticed until now. As the hours passed, the foreign fleet tried to probe the warship again, moving one vessel slightly closer. The system responded precisely, distributing energy to stabilizers and reinforcing protective shields. There was no damage, no explosions, no chaos. It was methodical, controlled, intelligent. The crew began to understand the power they had at their fingertips. Their confidence slowly grew as they realized the ship could withstand maneuvers that would normally cause panic or hesitation. On the deck, the commanding officer stood looking out at the other ships. He felt a mixture of relief and responsibility. Every decision mattered. One wrong move could have escalated the situation unnecessarily. But every correct decision reinforced what they already knew. This was no ordinary ship, and this was no ordinary crew. The quiet discipline of years of training, combined with the unexpected capabilities of the vessel, created a sense of harmony that was almost tangible. The foreign fleet hesitated again, clearly debating their next move. Some ships moved back slightly, testing limits, while others remained stationary. Their formation was no longer tight and confident. It wavered under the pressure of the unknown. The old warship, once ignored and ridiculed, had become a force to be reckoned with. And yet, it had not attacked. It had only protected itself and maintained calm, sending a clear message: underestimate us at your own risk. Meanwhile, inside the control room, junior officers monitored communication channels. They were tense, their hands moving quickly across consoles. Each time the foreign fleet tried to send a message, they responded politely but firmly, maintaining professional conduct while asserting boundaries. The crew was learning quickly that the old warship's strength didn't come from aggression. It came from precision, intelligence, and resilience. The commanding officer made another round on the bridge, checking in with everyone. He smiled quietly when he saw the young radar operator focusing intently, sweat on his brow, but steady hands on the console. "You're doing fine. Keep your eyes sharp," he said. The officer's calmness reassured the crew more than they could admit to anyone else. In a way, it reminded them that courage was not about being fearless. It was about staying focused when fear was present. At the same time, the retired engineer could hardly sit still. He paced back and forth, glancing out the window at the calm waves, while imagining the ship navigating each moment perfectly. He thought about every decision he had made during the design, every compromise he had faced, and every challenge he had overcome. It had all led to this moment, the ship proving itself not in training or theory, but in reality, under real conditions, with real stakes. As the day continued, the foreign fleet began to retreat slowly, no longer testing boundaries, but instead trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The old warship had shown its capabilities without firing a single shot. Its mere presence, combined with the intelligent operation of its systems, had forced hesitation, respect, and reconsideration. The crew watched with quiet satisfaction, realizing that the mission had already succeeded in ways no one could have predicted. By evening, the tension began to ease slightly. The foreign vessels were retreating toward international waters, their movements cautious and careful. The crew allowed themselves brief smiles, nods of acknowledgement, and quiet exclamations. They had done something remarkable. They had faced uncertainty, pressure, and doubt, and they had maintained control, dignity, and safety throughout. They had proven that appearances could be deceiving, that what was underestimated could turn out to be extraordinary. The commanding officer addressed the crew one last time before nightfall. We stayed calm. We followed procedure. We showed that we are capable without unnecessary risk. That is what matters. Good work, everyone. The words were simple, but they carried immense weight. They had not only followed orders, they had upheld the honor of the ship, the crew, and everyone who had built and maintained it. And they had done so with precision and care, proving that courage was more than boldness. It was steadiness, intelligence, and respect for every action. The crew settled in for the night, exhausted but proud. Some sat quietly in the mess hall, sipping tea and sharing whispered reflections on the day. Others remained at their stations, monitoring systems, ensuring that everything remained stable. No one spoke of celebration yet. There was still work to do, and they knew the mission was not entirely over. But for the first time, they understood the true power of their vessel, not in flashy displays, but in steady, controlled, intelligent action. Far away, the retired engineer finally allowed himself to sit down. He looked at his small wooden model of the ship, now slightly worn from years of handling, and smiled. He felt an overwhelming sense of relief, pride, and quiet joy. The world had not yet fully recognized what had happened, but he knew the truth. He had built something exceptional, something that could endure pressure, respond intelligently, and protect lives. Something that had been ignored for years, but had now revealed its true worth. As the sun set over the calm sea, casting long golden reflections across the water, the warship floated steadily, unbroken and unshaken. The crew looked toward the horizon, exhausted, but aware that they had participated in something extraordinary. It was not a battle in the traditional sense, and there had been no violence, but it was a victory of skill, intelligence, preparation, and courage. The day ended quietly, but the world had begun to take notice. The forgotten warship, once ridiculed and dismissed, had proven its value. Its crew, once unsure and anxious, had found confidence and pride. And far away, an old engineer smiled quietly, knowing that the moment he had hoped for, dreamed of, and waited decades to see, had finally arrived. The evening turning into night, the sky painted in deep blues and purples, scattered with the first stars of the night. The sea below reflected the sky, calm and still, a sharp contrast to the tension that had filled the day. The forgotten warship floated steadily, its crew finally able to take a brief moment to breathe after the intense hours of navigating uncertainty and pressure. Though the danger had eased, a quiet awareness settled over everyone on board. Their ship had proven itself. But the story was only beginning. Inside the mess hall, the crew gathered for a small meal. Their movements slower than usual, tired but satisfied. Conversations were low and cautious at first, more like soft murmurs than lively chatter. They didn't boast or celebrate. Instead, they spoke about the day in measured tones, sharing observations and reflecting on how things had unfolded. The commanding officer walked among them, nodding at their comments, occasionally asking questions to keep them thinking clearly. "What did you notice?" he would ask. "How did you handle it?" He was teaching them to process events, to learn from them, to build confidence that would last long after this mission ended. The young radar operator spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't know the system could do that. I didn't realize it was so precise." His eyes were wide with a mixture of disbelief and awe. A senior officer smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That's why we respect the design," he said. "It's not just steel and wires. It's intelligence built into every inch. It protects us, guides us, and gives us the chance to do our part without panic." Meanwhile, the commanding officer had taken a moment to walk on deck alone. The wind blew gently across the open water, carrying the faint smell of salt. He looked toward the horizon, where the last of the foreign fleet's ships had begun to retreat slowly. They weren't angry or defeated in a visible way, but there was no doubt that their perception had changed. The old warship they had underestimated had demonstrated something powerful: resilience, precision, and control without aggression. The commanding officer allowed himself a brief smile. This was exactly what he had hoped his crew would see, that courage and preparation could stand taller than fear or appearances not far away. The retired engineer sat quietly in his small home, a warm lamp illuminating his study. He had spent decades building that ship with his own hands, and for years no one had paid attention. Now, watching the news reports, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not pride in the way the world would see it, but a quiet, deep satisfaction. He remembered the endless nights at the shipyard, the frustration when people mocked him, the arguments over budgets and design decisions. Every decision, every choice, every sleepless night had led to this moment. He picked up the small wooden model of the ship that he had carved years ago. It was faded, the paint worn by time, but it reminded him of every detail he had imagined. He ran his fingers over the tiny hull, over the tiny panels and bridges he had shaped so carefully. In that moment, he could almost see the full ship in front of him, standing proud against the vast sea, just as he had imagined decades ago. His heart felt light, yet heavy at the same time. Relief, pride, nostalgia all mingled together. He whispered softly, "You did it. You proved it." Back on the warship, the crew began reporting minor observations from the day. Nothing critical, nothing alarming, just notes about system performance, the crew's own responses, and how they had managed moments of tension. Each report was received with attention and encouragement. The commanding officer emphasized that learning from these experiences was as important as the events themselves. "This is how we grow," he said. "Every calm decision, every measured action, every time we stayed steady, it counts. That is what makes a team strong." The first stars had fully appeared by now, and the sea was calm, almost eerily so. The warship floated in the quiet of the night, no longer under immediate pressure, yet fully alert. The crew began to relax in small ways. Some sat quietly, sipping tea, gazing at the horizon. Others wrote notes or checked equipment, ensuring that even in rest, they remained ready. The ship itself seemed calm, humming softly, the product of decades of careful design and expert maintenance. It had carried them safely through tension and uncertainty, silently proving the worth that the world had long ignored. On land, the engineer found himself reflecting on something he hadn't considered before: the human side of the ship. It wasn't just the metal, the engines, or the automated systems that had made it remarkable. It was the people who had operated it, the crew who had trusted it, and the discipline they had shown in the face of uncertainty. In a way, the ship had been a mirror of the crew, strong, prepared, intelligent, calm. Without them, the vessel might have remained just a set of parts floating in the sea. Together, they had achieved something greater than the sum of their pieces. News outlets began to report more details the following day. Analysts and experts were suddenly curious about the forgotten vessel. Some were surprised. Many were skeptical. They wanted to understand how a ship long considered outdated could respond with such efficiency and composure. The engineer watched quietly, aware that the public might never fully understand the careful thought, the years of dedication, or the small decisions that had made it possible. But that didn't matter to him. He had already seen the truth. The crew, too, began to understand the impact of their actions. They had navigated an unprecedented situation calmly and effectively. They had maintained safety without unnecessary aggression. They had demonstrated skill, patience, and intelligence in a situation where fear and uncertainty could have led to mistakes. They felt a new sense of confidence, not just in the ship, but in themselves. Each member understood quietly that this day had changed something fundamental, not just about the vessel, but about how they saw themselves as sailors, as team members, as individuals capable of extraordinary calm under pressure. The commanding officer gathered his crew on deck, one final time as night deepened. "You've done more than follow orders," he said. "You've shown that preparation, calmness, and intelligence matter more than appearances or assumptions. This ship, once overlooked, is now respected. And that respect comes from every one of you doing your part. Never forget that." The crew nodded, feeling a deep sense of shared accomplishment. They didn't need trophies, medals, or recognition. They had lived it, experienced it, and learned from it. In the quiet of his study, the engineer smiled one last time. He could almost imagine the crew resting peacefully, the ship gently floating on the calm waters, the systems humming as they always had. The ship had finally fulfilled its purpose in a way that no one expected. It had defended itself, protected its crew, and revealed its true capabilities, not through destruction, but through skill, intelligence, and calm determination. And in that moment, the engineer realized something important. Recognition, fame, and attention were never the goal. The goal had always been excellence, care, and perseverance. And now, after decades of waiting, the ship had proven that those values were enough. As the night deepened, a soft breeze carried the faint scent of salt and sea. The stars reflected on the gentle waves, and the ship floated silently, a quiet guardian that no one had expected to impress. The crew slept, rested, and prepared for the days ahead, carrying with them lessons that would last a lifetime. And far away, in a small home by the sea, an old engineer finally allowed himself to rest, knowing that something extraordinary, built with patience, care, and dedication, had finally been seen for what it truly was. The story didn't end with fireworks, applause, or dramatic headlines. It ended quietly, with pride, relief, and recognition in the hearts of those who mattered most, the crew who operated the ship and the engineer who created it. Sometimes, the most remarkable achievements don't announce themselves loudly. They prove themselves quietly, steadily, and without fanfare. And in this case, the world had finally glimpsed the truth of what had always been extraordinary.